Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 14 quarterback and tight end rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're covering all topics related to the quarterback and tight end positions, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points to opposing quarterbacks in a 4-point per passing touchdown league and tight ends in a half PPR scoring format in order to give ourselves more information regarding the most advantageous matchups going into this week. After we, of course, talk about matchups at each position, we'll go ahead and transition to our top 16 rankings at the tight end and quarterback position, as I'll go ahead and share with you guys my thought process and opinions and the statistics that justify my rankings as to how I think it's all going to stack up when it's all said and done at the end of Week 14. And as we all know, Week 14 is must win for many of us in order to get into our playoffs and make a run at the big dance. Of course, we have to make sure that our lineups are set and ready to go. So later tonight, after the Thursday Night Football game, I will be live streaming here on the channel for a couple hours for those of you who are interested in terms of asking questions and getting your lineup set for the upcoming weeks ahead. You can go ahead and drop on by asking questions if you're interested. Outside of that, of course, we will continue to stream every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. For those of you who are interested, Kickoff with Kirchhoff is always set on Sunday mornings. Outside of that, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel. My singular goal is, of course, to help you win a 2021 Fantasy Football Championship. So subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. It certainly does help me out a lot in terms of boosting the algorithm and getting this channel to continue to grow and get to many others to help them out themselves. Of course, outside of that, if you haven't checked them out already, Underdog Fantasy, it's a fantastic way to play fantasy football. Again, our season's coming to an end, but it doesn't mean you have to stop playing fantasy football. You can go ahead and draft teams for the NFL playoffs. There's best ball leagues for the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, in order to get yourselves ready. Or perhaps you can go ahead and participate in tonight's game between the Minnesota Vikings and Pittsburgh Steelers. I've gone ahead. I've already drafted 2 teams. Out of 3 teams, I got the number 3 position both times, and I'm quite happy as I was able to start Najee Harris and Deontay Johnson on one team and Justin Jefferson and Deontay Johnson on another. I think I'm in a pretty, advantageous position tonight. Hopefully, I end up winning something. If I do, I'll let you guys know. But either way, you can even go ahead and play the Pick'ems game for tonight. I think there's over 14 different statistical Pick'ems that you can make. If you are able to get 5 of those over-unders correctly, you can 20 times your money tonight. So again, check out Underdog Fantasy. Link down in the description. If you use promo code Andrew today, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. So again, if you're interested in doing so, that's a great way to start and get your bankroll moving. All right. Outside of that, let's go ahead and let's transition into our conversation for the tight end position for Week 14 of the 2021 fantasy football season. As you can see on screen, this is typically the stats that I go ahead and present to you guys on a weekly basis, with quarterbacks on the left and the tight ends on the right. Between weeks 8 through 15, as we can tell, in terms of fantasy points given up to opposing tight ends in a half PPR scoring format, the Philadelphia Eagles, Seattle Seahawks, Las Vegas Raiders have been the worst teams, therefore giving up the most points to opposing tight ends. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, San Francisco 49ers, and New England Patriots playing quite well against opposing tight ends. Now, typically, I just go ahead and throw these stats on screen on a weekly basis throughout these videos, but I wanted to go ahead and take a deeper dive at the tight end position between weeks 8 through 13 in order to give you some more context as to the stats that have been given up. As you can see, the reason why the Philadelphia Eagles have been giving up a bunch of points is because a lot of the teams in the National Football League know that their safeties and linebackers cannot cover opposing tight ends. And there's a reason they've been targeted 51 times in the last couple weeks, besides the fact that, yes, they've played against some pretty decent competition. At the same time, we have Ryan Griffin last week scoring a touchdown and having a fantasy relevant week. Also, on top of it, currently lead in the last 6 weeks of the season in terms of giving up touchdowns to opposing tight ends. That is a stat that we, of course, have to look at. But unfortunately, this week, the Eagles are on a bye, so we'll have to look at other matchups. Perhaps the Seahawks, the Las Vegas Raiders, of course, will get Travis Kelce. They'll have their hands full there. The Cleveland Browns against Mark Andrews. That's going to be tough for them. Cincinnati Bengals taking on, of course, George Kittle. Some of the best tight ends in the National Football League have the best matchups going into this week, which is extremely advantageous for those of you who are trying to win this week and get a huge performance out of them. While on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps a Rob Gronkowski taking on the Buffalo Bills may have you nervous. I'm not concerned about it. I am still firing up my studs, and we'll talk about that. But either way, wanted to present these statistics. You can, use them as you would like, but we will be referring back to them as we progress through the video. Once we get to the quarterback session, we'll go ahead and present those stats as well. But for right now, let's go ahead and continue with our tight ends. Beginning with our number 1 tight end on the week, we have Travis Kelce. Of course, Travis Kelce should continue to be number 1 every single week, but hopefully his performances are going to turn around, especially this week, considering they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. It is the 3rd best matchup at the position. I mean, this season alone, in the last 9 games of the season, the Las Vegas Raiders have given up 9 touchdowns to opposing tight ends. That is an unbelievable stat. Now, I understand Travis Kelce did not play well last week with only 3 catches on 8 total targets for 4.2 fantasy points, but the last time he took on the Las Vegas Raiders, this was a one-sided affair in which Patrick Mahomes absolutely dominated and, of course, got Travis Kelce heavily involved in the offense. 8 receptions, 119 yards, and 14.5 half PPR fantasy points. I think there's a great upside for Travis Kelce this week. Great matchup, stud player. We're firing him up. Moving on to George Kittle, again, another one of these studs. Of course, he takes on the Cincinnati Bengals, the 5th easiest matchup at the position. The stat that I wanted to go ahead and first and foremost mention, in the last 5 games, the Cincinnati Bengals have given up 4 touchdowns to opposing tight ends. That certainly bodes well for George Kittle because, of course, Deebo Samuel may miss another week with the groin injury. If that's going to be the case, well, we're coming off a week with no Deebo Samuel in the lineup and George Kittle completely dominating that Seattle Seahawks defense with 9 catches, a $181, 2 touchdowns, and 35.1 fantasy points. I mean, the last time we saw him have a 35-point explosion, it was only in 2020. Remember that Eagles game? He had himself a similar performance, and he could potentially go ahead and keep this momentum going. Since he's came back from his injury in Week 9, he's the number 1 overall tight end in fantasy, averaging 15.78 fantasy points per game. Again, he's a stud overall tight end. We're firing him up every opportunity we get. Moving on to number 3, Rob Gronkowski. Of course, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, you may be a little nervous playing him against the Buffalo Bills, considering the Bills have been one of the better teams in terms of giving up the fewest amount of points to opposing tight ends, but I'm not worried about Rob Gronkowski. Since Rob Gronkowski returned from his injury, from weeks 11 through 13, he's been the number 2 overall tight end in fantasy football, only behind George Kittle. He's been averaging 15.23 half PPR fantasy points, and in the last 3 weeks alone, this man has gotten 8, 9, and 8 total targets. As long as he's getting this wide variety and wide volume of targets, of course, this offense is going to continue to churn out great performances from their receiving options. Of course, we still have Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Leonard Fournette, all having great weeks, on top of the fact that Gronkowski is playing like a stud. He looks like the Gronkowski of old. He's kind of vitalized his entire career, which is insane considering he was already a Hall of Famer prior to his retirement. Either way, a stud player, number 3. Moving on to Mark Andrews, our number 4 overall option. Again, I always talk about it. Mark Andrews against the Cleveland Browns is one of the easiest matchups that he gets, and he typically always plays well against his division rivals. Specifically, going back to 2019, these are his fantasy point performances in a half PPR against Cleveland. Earlier this year, a couple weeks ago in week 12, 14.5 points. Then if you go back to 2020, 20.3, 10.3. You go back to 2019, 11.1, 24.3. There have been incredible performances, a lot of games in which he scores touchdowns against this defense. And by all means, the Cleveland Browns, they're giving up the 4th most points to opposing tight ends in the last 6 weeks of the season. Mark Andrews, an automatic stud play. Moving on to Dawson Knox. Again, Dawson Knox was in a matchup on Monday night in a terrible weather situation and against the Bill Belichick defense, like we all know, that loves to shut down opposing tight ends. We even heard it from the Manning cast. Aqib Talib was a guest. He even said that Bill Belichick tried to side him in the offseason, told him to come in and, of course, play as their cornerback that only covers tight ends in the National Football League. That's exactly what Bill Belichick does. He has a singular person that has the singular job of stopping opposing tight ends, and that's why they're so great at it. But either way, Dawson Knox had an opportunity of scoring a touchdown on Monday night. It literally hit him in the hands, and the defender was able to, pretty much knock it out. Otherwise, this man has a 10-plus point performance on Monday night, and he continues to have great, overall confidence from us. But going into this week, we all know Tampa Bay, they cannot stop opposing tight ends. This has been a plague for their defense for the last 2 years, and I think Dawson Knox, with the amount of touchdown upside he has, again, he's already scored 7 touchdowns this season already. He's tied with the likes of Hunter Henry at the position. I think Dawson Knox continues to have more and more value and solidifies himself as a top 5 this week. We go ahead and move on to our number 6, TJ Hockenson. TJ Hawkinson's coming off of back-to-back weeks of receiving touchdowns. When you can go ahead and do that, that's fantastic. In 2 out of the last 3 games that he has produced, he has had 8 or more targets. That's all we want. We want great opportunity that is going to lead to success. And though a backup tight end scored for the Detroit Lions last week, I'm not worried about it. As long as Jared Goff is continuing to find more comfort in this offense, and this offense has kind of gotten energy from winning last week against the Minnesota Vikings, then perhaps they're going to continue to air it out. And of course, give their best overall receiving option, TJ Hockenson, more opportunity down in the red zone. Because truly, at the tight end position, if you're not scoring touchdowns, it is really hard to be a top 12 player every given week. So hopefully, TJ Hawkinson's momentum continues. He scores a touchdown and gets some fantasy value for us. Moving on to Pat Freiermuth. Again, we talk about him every week considering how well he has played since week 6. Since week 6 of the 2021 fantasy football season, when Big Ben Roethlisberger has been under center, Pat Freiermuth has been the number 4 overall tight end, averaging 11.28 fantasy points per game. Now, I understand later tonight we will have Eric Kendricks and Anthony Barr back in the Minnesota Vikings lineup, and that certainly is going to play a huge difference. But Pat Freiermuth has very easily become one of the more reliable tight ends in the National Football League, despite the fact that even if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's able to get himself 6 to 8 points just off of receptions and receiving yards. And when you're able to have a safe floor of production at that point, then by all means, he's a must start every single week. Moving on to our number 8, we talk about Dalton Schultz of the Dallas Cowboys taking on the Washington football team. A couple things that I wanted to mention. Of course, because of the fact that Blake Jarwin is on the injured reserve, it continues to present more and more value and opportunity for Dalton Schultz in comparison to earlier this season. And of course, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a lot of opportunity go in the direction of a Dalton Schultz because of the injuries to CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, XYZ, all that kind of stuff that has kind of gone down. Of course, with Tony Pollard being banged up, of course, Zeke being banged up. Now, there is a conversation where Dalton Schultz pretty much is the healthiest player on that field in that offense on a weekly basis. And if that's going to continue to be the case, of course, he's going to continue to see the opportunities that he has. Coming off of a week at which he only put up 6.8 points. But again, anytime you're able to get 7 to 8 points from your respective tight end, even when they don't score a touchdown, that just means that their overall upside continues to rise every single week. I think Dalton Schultz is a fantastic play, especially in the matchup against the Washington football team. I know, of course, we saw, Foster Moreau soil his opportunity. He had a bunch of them down in the red zone, just wasn't able to haul in a couple of those passes that would have led to a touchdown. Let's move on to the second half of our tight end conversation, beginning with Zach Ertz of the Arizona Cardinals. Listen, I think Zach Ertz is a fantastic player. Taking on the Los Angeles Rams, the Rams have given up 3 receiving touchdowns to opposing tight ends in the last 4 games that they have played. I know Zach Ertz only had 1.5 fantasy points last week, but let's take into account that Kyler Murray only completed 11 passes last week in a very one-sided affair, in which, of course, the Chicago Bears, they threw 4 interceptions. I think Zach Ertz has a very great opportunity to not only get back on track this week, but show to all of us that he is going to be a 10-plus point, contributing tight end with Kyler Murray under center. I think we'll get back to it this week. Moving on to Tyler Conklin. Later tonight, I do anticipate Tyler Conklin being a great overall play, despite the fact that the Pittsburgh Steelers have been one of the better teams in the National Football League in terms of stopping opposing tight ends. They also haven't played too many great ones. With the current situation of the Minnesota Vikings and Adam Thielen being out later tonight, I think there's a very good chance in which Tyler Conklin is asked to do a lot more than he typically does on a weekly basis, specifically in the receiving game, because we know he is a blocking tight end, but can he get it done through the air? In the 4 games this season that he has 7 or more targets, he averages 10.2 fantasy points per game. As long as this man gets the opportunity, he will be able to deliver, and that's what I anticipate him to do later tonight. Moving on to Kyle Pitts, our number 11. Again, Kyle Pitts currently at the tight end position, if I'm not mistaken, is number 3 in terms of total receiving yards. And with that being the case, he still only has 1 touchdown. And that's what makes his overall performances extremely underwhelming. Though he was able to put up 6.8 fantasy points last week, where we drafted him and what he's been able to produce are not lining up, which makes it very difficult to start him in comparison to a lot of these other options. With that mentioned, my only concern about Kyle Pitts is what happened last time when they take on the Carolina Panthers. Stephon Gilmore shadowed him and completely shut him down, which is unfortunate. But as we saw last week, Kyle Pitts played from the inline 38% of the time, played out wide 32% of the time, and played in the slot 30% of the time. He's playing a pretty even, distribution in terms of where he lines up on the field. But with that being the case, if they have the ability to have Stephon Gilmore continue to shadow him, despite the fact that Dante Jackson is out for the Carolina Panthers secondary, then there's a situation where Kyle Pitts gets completely shut down. But if in fact they're not going to have him shadow, and Kyle Pitts can move around the formation, find himself open in many scenarios, then he'll be great. But again, the ever-elusive touchdown will be tough to find. Moving on to Noah Fant, our number 12. Again, playing against the Detroit Lions defense, they're giving up the 8th most points to opposing tight ends. Let's read some recent performances from said tight ends, and just to kind of give you some more confidence for Noah Fant this week. Conklin, 7 catches, 56. Komet, 8 catches, 65. In the same game, Jimmy Graham, 2 catches, 34, and a touchdown. Hooper, 4 catches, 53. Goddard, 6 catches, 72. Yes, they're not the greatest performances of all time, but at least they're getting the receiving yards that you certainly need to be a relevant tight end. Moving on to Tyler Higbee. Again, Tyler Higbee is a great player, but in this current offense, the way that it's structured, in terms of the way that they're running the ball and passing to OBJ and Van Jefferson, and of course Cooper Kupp getting his, it has left Tyler Higbee as like the fourth or fifth option in this offense on a weekly basis. Though they do play against the Arizona Cardinals, who recently against Chicago gave up 4 catches, 42, and a touchdown to opposing tight ends, and against George Kittle gave up 6 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown. There could be a possibility in which Tyler Higbee has himself a great performance here, but it is certainly going to be a stretch. He did have himself 7.3 fantasy points. We will take that any given week from our respective tight end. But at this point, Tyler Higbee needs to have that touchdown to get him over the top. And I don't know if it's going in his direction because it's so difficult to predict that stat. Let's move on to Jared Cook, our number 14. If in fact Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are going to miss this week, and we haven't seen any indication as their status completely being out, there has been nothing of the sense from what I have seen. Perhaps after this video, we may hear something on Friday or Saturday that may give us the indication. But for right now, if both of them end up being out, then of course Jared Cook's an even better play than number 14. But I think either way, maybe one of them miss, which just may give him enough targets to keep him relevant in this top 16 conversation. Moving on to 15, Ricky Seals-Jones. With Logan Thomas pretty much being done for the rest of the year, I think Ricky Seals-Jones is pretty safe, but the conversation is whether or not he's going to even play. He hasn't played in the last 3 weeks. He was limited this week in terms of his overall participation, dealing with a hip injury. If he ends up playing, I have confidence that he could be a great play. From weeks 5 through 7 of the 2021 season, he was the number 8 overall fantasy tight end with 9.5 fantasy points. There is a lot of potential for Ricky Seals-Jones. He just has to take the opportunity and be healthy enough to be able to strike on it. Moving on to our final tight end option of the video, we have Foster Moreau. I know Darren Waller is most likely not going to play considering he didn't practice Wednesday or earlier today. Foster Moreau had opportunities. If he had delivered on them, he would have had at least 3 or 4 catches, would have potentially had a touchdown, and been a great overall fantasy play. Unfortunately, got us a goose egg. But that is just the nature of the beast, and we have to just continue to keep pushing and hoping that Foster Moreau can get back on track. All right, now that we've talked about our top 16 tight ends, let's go and talk about matchups at the quarterback position before we end today's video. So let's talk about our weeks 8 through 13 quarterback stats allowed as to how many points defenses are giving up to opposing quarterbacks in a standard 4-point per passing touchdown league. As you can see, the New Orleans Saints, Minnesota Vikings, Chicago Bears, New York Jets, Tennessee Titans, Las Vegas Raiders, they are giving up a boatload of points to opposing tight ends. Almost 19 plus points every single week throughout the last 6 weeks of the season. Now, of course, there are other ends of the spectrum with the New England Patriots, the Buffalo Bills, the Carolina Panthers, Cleveland Browns. They have given up very few points to opposing quarterbacks, and though they may scare us in some scenarios, I'm not afraid of playing Tom Brady against the Buffalo Bills. He's done it for a majority of his career, and of course, he's in a completely different offense, and one that is quite improved in comparison to the last time he took on the Buffalo Bills. So yes, these are some stats. We definitely do want to take advantage of some of the matchups. And, some of them may be great, but can you really trust Ben Roethlisberger tonight? Can you really trust, Zach Wilson playing against the New Orleans Saints? Though he came off of a great league last week in which he scored 3 touchdowns, it may not be enough to push it over the edge and give us the confidence in doing so. But either way, these are the stats in terms of passing yards, passing touchdowns, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and fantasy points allowed on average per week over the last 6 weeks of the season. Now that we've covered that, we will refer back to these statistics. But let's go ahead and let's transition to our top 16 quarterback rankings for the week. Beginning with our number 1, we have Kyler Murray. Again, of the Arizona Cardinals, coming off a 30-point fantasy performance. Now, many of us were wondering, is Kyler Murray even healthy? Well, by all means, he came off of a game in which he had the most rushing yards of his entire season here. Of course, 59 total for 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns, with only 15 total passing attempts, was able to get himself 123 yards, 30.82 fantasy points. That's all I pretty much ask for. I mean, Kyler Murray, if you're able to continue to put up 25 plus points from here on out, which I anticipate being the case considering how great this offense looks with D-Hop healthy and back, Zach Ertz injected into this lineup, I think Kyler Murray is for sure every single week a must start at the quarterback position. And for this week, playing against the Rams, he's my number 1. Moving on to our number 2, we have Josh Allen, another one of these young and hungry quarterbacks that continues to run the ball. Again, Josh Allen's coming off of another week in which he had, 39 rushing yards. Again, multiple times in the last 8 weeks here, we have seen, I think, 5 out of the last 8 weeks where he's getting over 30, 40 rushing yards and getting himself more involved throughout the running game. Because when they get into situations where they play against teams that are great at stopping the run, again, their entire offense kind of folds, and it forces Josh Allen to have to move in the pocket and get yards with his legs. And when we're specifically talking about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers matchup, of course, that is going to be a tough one for Matt Breida, Zach Moss, and Devin Singletary. So I do anticipate Josh Allen to run the ball. Not only that, he's going to be able to air it out. On Monday, of course, the weather was not primed and ready for him to throw the ball. He had a lot of inaccurate missed targets. Again, he could have gotten himself very easily 3 touchdowns in that game, but unfortunately did not go in his direction. I think he'll get back on track this week in Tampa. It's going to be a pretty fair weather game there. And overall, I think Josh Allen will get back on track and kind of prove to all of us once again, he's one of the best in the league. Moving on to Justin Herbert, our number 3. If Keenan Allen and Mike Williams end up playing, this is going to be a blowout. I mean, this is going to be another one of these games where the Chargers put up 40-plus points, similar to last week. So if, in fact, that's going to be the case, by all means, we're firing up Justin Herbert. Even in a scenario in which Justin Herbert does not have one of those 2 wide receivers, I still think he's a great play because the fact of the matter is he has been on a hot streak as of late, and he continues to put up great performances, over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns last week. I think with the ability for him to not only get it done through the air, have the ability against the Pittsburgh Steelers to get 90 rushing yards on the ground, he can pretty much do it any which way he wants. It's just a matter of what will be available for him out wide. Regardless, I think he's going to be a fantastic play and our number 3 for this week. Moving on to number 4, we have Aaron Rodgers, the thumbnail of today's video. I think Aaron Rodgers has already proven to us, not only in just the last 2 weeks, but in the last couple of years, that against Chicago, I mean, it's just a cakewalk for him. I mean, he's had 10 touchdowns in the last 3 games that he's played against the Chicago Bears. In the last 2 weeks of the season, with, of course, his broken pinky toe, he's been able to throw for 385 and 307 yards in those 2 games, 4 touchdowns and 2 touchdowns, 0 interceptions in both games, was able to get a rushing touchdown in the game in which he only had 2 passing touchdowns. So, again, 4 and 3 so far. And his fantasy point contributions in terms of a 4-point per passing touchdown, like 33.5 and 26.28. Can we really argue against Aaron Rodgers at this point? Absolutely not. And with his wide receivers healthy, with Aaron Jones back in the lineup, and his offensive line getting back on track, I think Aaron Rodgers, of course, another must play. Moving on to Patrick Mahomes. Listen, the only hope that I have is that Patrick Mahomes has another breakout performance here, and then he'll go back to being, mediocre in the upcoming weeks. But hopefully, he will be able to deliver a great performance here against the Las Vegas Raiders, giving up the 6th most points to opposing quarterbacks. A couple weeks back in Week 10, Patrick Mahomes was able to put up a 400 passing yard, 5 touchdown game. If he can get back to doing something like that, then by all means, he'll be great. But I want to go ahead and point a stat out. In weeks 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, and 13, if you combine all those performances, he will have totaled for 5 touchdowns in those 6 games. That's crazy because it literally only took him 1 game to get 5 touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders. So we're hoping for the best. I talked about it with Tyreek Hill yesterday. This team averages over 35 points per game against the Las Vegas Raiders since 2018. Hopefully Patrick Mahomes is ready with the game plan. Moving on to Lamar Jackson. Though Lamar Jackson's had some, lackluster performances as of late, I don't really mind it. The fact that he's able to run the ball as effectively as he does and continue to create a baseline of value for himself every week, and the fact that he's been throwing the ball as well as he has in comparison to years past. I mean, he used to never throw the ball. Truly, he used to barely ever get to the situation where he's throwing for 300 yards, 400 yards, but he's done that multiple times this year. He's throwing more than ever, and hopefully that'll continue to persist because that is going to continue to, kind of increase his overall value. Besides the rushing yards that are always going to be automatic, the ability to get more yards through the air makes him that much more of a viable play. I understand he has been underwhelming, but hopefully this week against the Cleveland Browns should be a pretty easy matchup. Moving on to our number 7, we have Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys taking on the Washington football team, giving up the 13th most points to opposing quarterbacks. I understand last week's performance was underwhelming, but I mean, when you have a situation where Taysom Hill is just throwing consecutive interceptions in the second half, and you've already mounted a pretty sizable lead considering, of course, Tony Pollard's big 50-plus yard run, then of course Dak Prescott's not going to be asked to throw the ball. Of course, they didn't even have a lot of their coaching staff available because of the virus IR. They had them knocked out. Mike McCarthy wasn't even there. So the last week was a little bit of a different one for the Dallas Cowboys. Hopefully this week we'll be getting back on track, and Dak Prescott will get back to his days of 2 or more passing touchdowns per week. Moving on to Tom Brady, our number 8. Of course, Tom Brady, regardless of who he plays against, he's playing out of his absolute mind. But the thing that I wanted to mention as to why I have Tom Brady at number 8 in comparison to anything higher, despite coming off of a 4 passing touchdown week, is yes, there's a huge difference between playing against the Atlanta Falcons and Buffalo Bills secondary. And mainly when you play against the Buffalo Bills, a lot of teams have found that running the ball literally down their throat is the best way of doing it. There's a reason why Mac Jones only had 3 passing attempts the other day against this defense, because all you have to do is run the ball and you will find success. There's a reason why Jonathan Taylor had a 50-point fantasy game this season. I think Lombardi Lenny is going to be the reason why Tom Brady has a little bit of a lesser week, because they're going to be able to run the ball. I don't think the Bills will be able to stop them. And when that's continuing to just find more and more success, of course, his value will be a little bit diminished in comparison to that 4-touchdown week against the Falcons, which again still makes Tom Brady an extremely valuable prospect, but not as valuable as we may think. Moving on to Matthew Stafford, our number 9. Again, Matthew Stafford, when he plays against really good teams, he still has himself good performances, though it may be a little bit of garbage time here and there. The last time he took on the Arizona Cardinals, he did struggle. That secondary completely eliminated the participation of one Cooper Kupp. And if that's going to be the case once again, where they're shutting down Cooper Kupp and not allowing him to do much, I don't think he was able to get over 100 yards or a touchdown in that game earlier this season. If they're able to do that once again and replicate that kind of performance defensively, then it's going to leave Matthew Stafford in a pretty rough position. With that said, I think Matthew Stafford is an extremely talented quarterback, and of course, he still has other options in Van Jefferson and Odell Beckham Jr., Tyler Higbee, and of course, whoever is the starting running back in this backfield. But I'm just expecting a little bit of a limited overall performance, and I'm not expecting the entire world of a 30-point game. I'm more of a thinking probably like 18, 19 points out of this respective quarterback. Moving on to Taysom Hill, our number 10. Taysom Hill is coming off a week in which he had 11 carries for 101 yards. Now he takes on the New York Jets, who are giving up the most points to opposing running backs in the National Football League. And the reason why I wanted to mention Taysom Hill in this regard was because, of course, he is practically a running back. I mean, when he is literally standing in the backfield and they're running quarterback power, quarterback counter, and just pounding the rock against the Dallas Cowboys defense, I can only imagine what they'll be able to do against the Jets, who are not only giving up the most points to opposing running backs this season, but the 4th most points to opposing quarterbacks. Gardner Minshew came off the bench and just torched them. Taysom Hill should be a fantastic play this week. Moving on to Kirk Cousins, our number 11. Later tonight against the Pittsburgh Steelers, I mean, Kirk Cousins should be fine. Even without Adam Thielen in the lineup, we've seen him, with only Justin Jefferson as his primary receiver, be a complete monster and dominate. But it's just a matter of whether or not we're going to see, Kirk Cousins have that, primetime television slump. We've seen it in the past. I'm hoping that's not going to be the case. He's coming off a week and still against the Detroit Lions in which he got 300 plus yards, of course, 2 touchdowns. If he's able to have himself another great performance as such, then by all means, we should be in a great position. The Pittsburgh Steelers defense has been horrible as of late. With their top cornerback once again out, I think Kirk Cousins is in a good position. Moving on to Russell Wilson, I understand you may be afraid of Russell Wilson, but I feel like he got back on track last week. Being able to put up as many points as they were able to against the San Francisco 49ers, of course, coming off of the week prior in which he had that 90-yard drive to almost force that game into overtime against the Washington football team, he's kind of gotten back on track. And the fact that they take on the Houston Texans, of course, that should be one of the easiest, matchups you could possibly find. Though the Houston Texans haven't given up very many points to quarterbacks as of late, let's just be honest. It's the Houston Texans defense. A lot of teams just run the ball and kill clock in the second half. With the Seahawks having troubles doing so, I think Russell Wilson will be able to air it out and find fantasy value in doing so. Moving on to Joe Burrow, still dealing with a little bit of that pinky injury. Hasn't been able to throw for 2 touchdowns in the last 5+ weeks here. Joe Mixon has been the entire offense. And if Joe Mixon's going to weak, then it's going to have to be Samaje Perine. But we'll wait and see exactly what we're going to see out of a Joe Burrow. I expect him to still be fine. I still expect him to be a great play. Still had himself 2 touchdowns last week, not 2 passing touchdowns, but I'll take the rushing touchdown, especially considering he was able to do it this last week and the week prior against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The more mobility we see from Joe Burrow, the more potential he has to be an even better quarterback play. Moving on to Derek Carr, number 14. Again, though Derek Carr wasn't able to score a touchdown last week, it's just a matter of whether or not he's going to be able to compete with Kansas City. That secondary has been gnarly as of late. This defense hasn't really given up many points to opposing offenses, similar to the last time that they took on the Las Vegas Raiders. So the question is Derek Carr, even without Darren Waller, a safe enough play? I think he is, in the regard that he'll probably score at least 1 touchdown and get enough yardage in garbage time to kind of mellow him out as like a 15, 16-point quarterback. But if he's able to reach his upside, then by all means, he could be a 20-point play. Moving on, we have Taylor Heinicke. Again, Taylor Heinicke just fills in the spot of like a Tua, Carson Wentz, who aren't available this week because they're on by Jalen Hurts. So Taylor Heinicke taking on the Dallas Cowboys, in my opinion, shouldn't be too difficult. Taysom Hill was still able to find himself relative success against that secondary, despite the fact that his finger literally was working against him. But either way, I think Taylor Heinicke's played well. This team's on a winning streak. They'll continue to run the ball, use play action, and get this man into advantageous positions. Moving on. Our final quarterback of the week is Jimmy Garoppolo. I've mentioned this in the last couple weeks. he has had himself great performances of 2 or more touchdowns overall. And if he's able to continue to string together performances as such, once you get into the fantasy playoffs, he's going to be really valuable. So not only is he a potential pickup, but he's a guy that I'm willing to start this week against Cincinnati's defense, who of course gave up a bunch of points to Justin Herbert, and his arm just completely just airing it out and dominating that secondary. I think Jimmy Garoppolo would be in a pretty advantageous position if, in fact, we are going to see Elijah Mitchell miss and maybe get Debo back in the lineup. Maybe even if, in fact, we don't see a Debo, this team may be a pass-heavy team with George Kittle, Ayuk. Not a bad option this week as our number 16. These are my Week 14 quarterback and tight end rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change, but if you want to go ahead and stay up to date with my rankings, you can check out my Patreon link down in the description. Of course, show up Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as I'll be live streaming kickoff with Kirkhoff. Do not forget, we will have a live stream later tonight after the Thursday night football game, talking about, of course, everything that we saw during the game and anything to help us get prepared for Week 14. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you have not yet already. Click the like button down below and check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. There's a link down in the description for Underdog. And until tomorrow or Saturday, Hidden Gems, I'll see you guys. Peace.